Welcome to What's Your Story, and my guest is Chris Storr QC. Hello, Chris.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for giving the time to come and tell your story. But I know you're an author, and I know you're a barrister, and I know you're doing some fantastic work. But before we get to that, can we talk about the path that led you to that, really? So can we start maybe when you were young, little at school? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Milton Keynes, and very ordinary background. My parents didn't go to university themselves. My mum started life as a shop assistant and ended her working life as a care assistant in an old people's home. My dad was a builder, self-employed builder, working on building sites for most of my childhood, and I often worked on the building sites with him in the summer holidays and stuff, and so very kind of ordinary background. Went to state schools, state primary schools, and then on to a state comprehensive, which didn't have particularly high levels of aspiration or particularly high levels of achievement amongst most of the pupils. But I basically just ended up with a piece of good fortune, which was that in the summer after I'd done my O-levels, when I was 16, I decided to go and seek my fortune by selling donuts on the beaches of the south of France.
Really?
Hitchhiked all the way down there. Lasted, I think, 3 or 4 weeks possibly before I ran out of money and enthusiasm for this particular life choice. So I made my way back to Britain. And when I got back, my mum and dad had moved to a completely different place, about 180, 90 miles north of Milton Keynes, up on the northwest coast. And it just so happened that they had moved within a mile or so of one of the best state sixth form colleges in the country, and faced with a choice of getting a job at 16, and there weren't many around in the mid-80s, or going to college. I managed to get into college, and effectively it was that which led me to, for the first time, really engage with education and start to learn and open up my horizons a bit. So as with so many kids from, I guess, ordinary or working class backgrounds, whatever you want to call it, it's education is what makes the difference. It's what gets you the opportunities which otherwise you wouldn't have.
So did they make that move thinking that you would go to college because you were obviously a bright boy?
No, they didn't, not at all. One of the reasons I think they made the move was because I effectively was saying I'm leaving home, and I'm going off to seek my fortune. So they decided to go and live there. It was where my mum came from originally, and they decided to move there. I think partly because my dad's health wasn't great. He had poor knees, and he'd been working on building sites for a long time, and he wanted to find a different kind of way of life in terms of protecting himself physically. So no, it was just sheer coincidence that sixth form college was there, and sheer coincidence that it was one of the best, as I say. And at the time, I think it was in the top 10 for A-level results amongst state sixth forms in the whole country, whereas my secondary school, my comprehensive school, was a really low performing school, and frankly nobody went to university from there. So had I stayed there, or had my parents carried on living there, there's no chance that I'd be here now or having this conversation with you.
Yeah, because I suppose I imagine, and I think times are changing. I do hope they are. But a few years ago, most people that have achieved what you have would have come from the public schools and would have probably either followed in some sort of family line of business and got there. It's kind of, it might be a misconception, but you tend to think that if you're a barrister, you probably went to a very good school and you probably had a very good education, you're probably from a very wealthy family, but that's not the case.
Well, it's not the case with everybody, that's for sure, but there is still an overwhelming overrepresentation of privately educated people amongst the senior levels of the legal profession, including QCs and judges, where an enormous number in comparison to the general population are from that kind of background that you describe. Yes, there are an increasing number of people from other backgrounds. I say an increasing number. There was an increasing number, but in recent times, because of the increased costs of legal education, and I think because of the increasing difficulty of securing training contracts and pupilages, I think those from perhaps less wealthy backgrounds are actually being put off and are avoiding going into legal practice. So you are seeing, I'm afraid, a return to that kind of imbalance. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. I campaign and I speak in schools. I've been back to speak at my old school in Milton Keynes more than once. And I speak in schools all over the country just to try and get the message through to kids from the sorts of what you might call non-traditional backgrounds, at least for the legal world. So you've got to go for it. You've got to do it, because if you don't, you will let yourself down. And sadly, there isn't enough support out there in our state education system to really encourage kids from every kind of background, every walk of life, to achieve whatever their goals might be. There isn't enough, and the education system is massively underfunded. And there are shining examples of excellence, but also a great deal of mediocrity and poor performance out there. And it's a real shame for our society, really.
So, do you think having that background, do you think that made you a more compassionate person, more, because you are very, very much about understanding people's backgrounds, aren't you, and working out why they are the way they are? I mean, you really are a very caring person.
I hope so, but I'm not sure that that's because of my background. I mean, I think you can be from any background and have an empathetic approach to your fellow human beings. I don't think I think it's given me a broader experience of the human condition.
That's probably what I'm trying to say. Yeah, going to being in an ordinary sort of school with normal kind of life around you. I say that from the perspective of my son was also privately educated, and there is a difference. There is a difference.
Oh yes, well, my children are, to be perfectly honest with you, and I agree that there is, but the difference depends very much on the school. I mean, there are some excellent state schools out there, and obviously there's some particularly grammar schools and schools in certain areas which perform incredibly well in the state sector and are pretty much comparable to most private schools. But when you take the sort of lowest level of attainment in the state sector versus the highest level in the private sector, they are worlds apart, as you know, and the difference is quite extraordinary. And so I think I don't think we should pigeonhole or characterize all state education as being of one variety, because it is enormously varied. And the quality varies, and that's one of the travesties actually, is that if you have parents who are lucky enough to be able to perhaps buy a house in an area which has good schools and good catchment areas, then you're likely to be able to get access to better state education than someone whose parents don't have those choices and don't have the economic wherewithal to move house to achieve a higher standard of education. So I think for me, you're right. I do think I understand people fairly well, and but I mean, you can come from any background. I mean, if you think about it, I guess you could argue, well, if you come from a more privileged background, that you have an exposure to a very different way of life, and it's just a different experience, but it's not necessarily any less valuable for that. But I think in criminal law, in particular, I think having a really acute understanding of the lives of people across society, from, I don't want to say from top to bottom, but I mean, you know what I mean, people who are the most privileged to the least privileged, I think is really, really helpful in doing my job.
So you went to this college. I know we kind of digress there, but you went to the college and then you decided to study law?
Yeah, well, that came about by sheer chance as well, because I went to the careers centre in the latter stages of the first year of A-level, so lower sixth in effect. And there was, even in those days, in the 80s, they had computers which you could do a questionnaire as to what you like and didn't like. And so I did this questionnaire, and it asks what particular things that you might enjoy, and what you find challenging, and what you don't positively dislike. Anyway, you answer all of these questions, and at the end, it a fairly rudimentary system in those days, I'm sure, but a printout came out, and the printout said there are two jobs that you could potentially do. One was being an actor, and the other was being a barrister.
They say there's a very similar thing there, don't they?
Possibly, but you know, there were no other options available to me according to the computer. So I went. I remember sort of thinking about. I mean, I'd done a bit of acting at college and stuff, and you know, I quite enjoyed all of that. But I didn't really see it as being a job or a career. You know, I'm pretty sure wouldn't have had anywhere near the talent required either. So what I did was I actually went along to the courts in my summer holidays in between the first and second year of A-levels and watched trials, watched criminal trials, watched murder trials, watched drugs conspiracy trials, and just sat in the public gallery and absorbed the atmosphere and watched the drama and saw the performances, if you want to call it that, of the barristers in the wigs and the gowns and all the stuff. And to be honest, within a day or two, it was one of the most thrilling experiences I've ever had, just to watch it happen from the gallery. Now, subsequently then thinking through, well, I could actually do that myself. I mean, it's not something I talked about the random chance of my parents moving, but also there's a random chance of that computer thing, because I don't even think I even knew what a barrister was until that computer was out. So again, had that not happened, there's every chance that I would never have stumbled across a legal career of any kind, let alone one which has, fortunately, for the last 26 years or so, has been reasonably successful.
So then why criminal law? Why go that route? Sort of.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the answers might be because I understood so little about the law and about the legal system and about the legal profession. All I really knew was what you see on TV, which was predominantly about criminal cases. I mean, drama series or whatever it might be. They're almost always about criminal law. They're very rarely about, you know, corporate law or contract law or something like that. So obviously, when I chose to go and watch cases at court, I went to a criminal trial with a jury, because that's kind of what I thought law was. And so that was my first taste of it in real life, so to speak. And it was even more dramatic and fascinating in real life than it had been on TV dramas or on films. So I was just hooked from as soon as I went into a criminal courtroom. I just thought, this is just amazing. I can't believe this is a job. This is an actual job that people get paid for, to come along and do this. And not only is it incredibly dramatic and fascinating, but lives depend on it. You know, people may or may not go to prison for 20 years as a result of something that happens in this particular environment, in this courtroom. And you know, the level of sort of human interest, which is something, as you pointed out earlier, is a big part of kind of who I am, is being very interested in people. But the human interest of being exposed to that level of extremity in people's lives was something which I found absolutely intoxicating and almost addictive. And I kept going back and watching case after case. So once I'd become, you know, kind of enamored of criminal law for those reasons and in that way, I never really considered any other kind of law, really.
I think the thing is, you know, it's a strange old thing, isn't it? Unless you really start to look into something, you aren't necessarily aware of it, or unless it touches you, you're not aware of it. And I worked for some time with, I'm moving on to sort of the law, the criminal law. And for some time I worked with Bedfordshire Police, and I worked with them with road death, you know. So it seemed really out of sync with me, and looking from the point of view of the families, that somebody who had recklessly driven their car and killed a child would get 2 year in prison, and somebody who had murdered somebody might only get 5 years in prison, or you know, it didn't. The sentences didn't seem to fit. And from the point of view of the families, they obviously initially would want justice and would want that person, because they've taken their child, put away for a very long time. But after a little while, they'd start to see that actually that isn't going to bring their child back. And what's it doing? What is it doing? And I'm guessing that, you know,
I think picking cases of death by dangerous driving is a really helpful example, because I have defended in such cases on many occasions, and they are very difficult, because when you think about it, much of the behaviour that is involved in dangerous driving, or nowadays careless driving, and we have an offence of death by careless driving now, the driving involved is the sort of driving that everybody's done. You know, there are a few people who have never accidentally gone through a red light. There are a few people who have never pulled out at a junction without quite looking and looking what was coming. But most drivers have pulled out on the motorway into the next lane and then realise there's another car there, or, you know, that they haven't looked properly in their mirrors. So that behaviour, 99 times out of 100, or probably more like 9,990 times out of 1,000, doesn't cause any harm. Nobody dies. You don't have a crash. You just carry on and you go. You're a bit shaken maybe, but you just carry on your way. But the point I'm making is that if that 1 in 1,000 occasion you happen to go into someone on a motorbike, or as you say, you know, in some ways more tragically, you happen to go into the lane and there's a crash and a child dies, then suddenly there's a clamour for very, very heavy prison sentences, even though the moral kind of opprobrium, if you like, to the act itself is no different to the way the rest of us drive all the time. I say all the time, but occasionally we all break the rules of the road. We all, you know, drive with slightly less care than we should, but we get away with it because nothing happens. And many of those people who clamour for the long sentences will have done the same thing themselves the day before, maybe in the same day, have pulled out or done one of these sort of acts of driving and not killed anyone. But if you think about it, what they did was just as bad as the person who just by sheer chance happened to kill someone. So for me, I think that's one of the major problems with sentencing, is that we have got a mindset now that you sentence not by how bad or guilty the person is, but by the consequences of their actions, of which they had no control, and which is sheer random chance and could have happened to anyone. So I, for one, don't agree with the mindset that you sentence on the basis of just because someone died. Because, of course, people die in accidents, genuine accidents. I mean, and there's no one suggests that you should go to prison if you kill someone in an accident. And the line between accidental and careless and dangerous driving is really quite small in many cases. Of course, there are examples, people who drive after taking lots of drugs at 100 miles an hour down the wrong way down the street. And that, I sort of understand the way that the view that people take, because most people don't do those things. But when you talk about driving, which is quite commonplace, then I think we need to have another think about it. I mean, I have to say, I think your example of 5 years for murder is unrealistic. I've never known.
Sometimes they don't. Well, I was just thinking of I was just sort of throwing that in, but I'm not necessarily thinking that. I'm thinking they don't seem. Sometimes somebody, I don't know, they commit a robbery, and they get less of a sentence. The person that's killed a child, and maybe with drugs or drink, or they've mounted a payment or whatever, and it is reckless driving, they seem to get small sentences, and then other people doing other crimes get, the sentencing doesn't seem right. But I mean, I do stand with you on what is the sentencing about anyhow, because what do we actually achieve?
I think one of the myths around there, and I'm not sure, I don't think you're expressing the myth in what you've just said, but one of the myths is that sentences are somehow getting softer, or they're lighter or lower. That's completely untrue. Since I came to the bar 20 odd years ago, sentences have got higher and higher and higher, including death by dangerous cases, where the maximum sentence has almost doubled in that time, or may have doubled, and where the sentences actually imposed under the guidelines are higher than they've ever been. So all of that clamoring amongst the public and saying we want longer sentence, well, the public have got what they asked for. They've therefore got the doubling of the prison population, which we've seen in the last 25 years as well, from about 40,000 to over 80,000. So we're locking more people up for longer than ever. So what more do people want? Do you want to double it again? Keep on going? How long do you go? And do you want to be like America and actually have millions of people in prison? I mean, people want these things. Then by all means, ask for them. Tell your politicians you want them. Vote for politicians who offer them. But accept, as is the main premise of my book, accept that the consequence of all of that is you'll get more crime, and more people will be murdered, and more people will be stabbed or shot on the streets in the course of their daily lives, and more people, and worst of all, will get that knock on the door to say, I'm sorry to tell you, but your 12-year-old son's been killed today. And that's what the ever increasing demands for higher and higher sentences leads to, inevitably, in every society, where it's practiced, long sentences, harsh sentences lead to more crime. It's just it's a timeless fact.
Mm. And then on the other thing that I know that you're working about is legalizing drugs. And there's a girl that I spoke to recently whose daughter died at a festival taking drugs, and she wants them legalized, because if they're legalized, and I agree with you again that, you know, if they're legalized, it does stop drug trafficking, it stops people. Well, it goes back to the crimes that are needed in order that the drugs are there, and it means that what people are taking and what children are likely to take is going to be more monitored, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, you mentioned the festival. I don't know if that was someone involved in Anyone's Child, which is a fantastic campaign. And I interviewed the mother of one of the children who died in the same circumstances at the age of 15 for the book. And there's a section of the book about that tragic case. And the reason that she died, her name was Martha Fernback. The reason she died because she had bought, or she and her friends had bought MDMA powder. And had no idea that it was 91% pure, when 91% of MDMA powder would kill a horse. So, and that wouldn't happen in a licensed and regulated market where the packet said, it wouldn't say 91%, because no one would ever sell 91% pure MDMA.
She's talking about having these booths where you can take the drug that you're about to take, and it can be checked, and then you will know what you're taking.
In certain festivals, and in fact, I know very well the senior police officer who introduced that somewhat controversial policy at the Leeds Festival some years ago. And the police took the view in West Yorkshire that they were going to try and save lives rather than try to enforce drug laws. That didn't work. And they were much more concerned about the health of the young people on the festival side than they were arresting people for supply or indeed possession of a small amount of personal use drugs. So it's absolutely sensible, but of course you only need that because the supply chain is in the hands of criminals, and they don't care what's in it. I mean, they don't know themselves. If you're mixing a toxic substance or something that's potentially deadly in a kitchen blender with bits and pieces of whatever powder you've got lying around, you've got no ability to control the strength or the toxicity of the product. Whereas if it's produced in a pharmaceutical laboratory and sold in blister packs and has exactly the contents on the packet, well, even if it is sold illegally or makes its way illegally to children, then at least as when children get hold of alcohol illegally, at least they know what they're drinking and they know what they're taking. Now, that's not to encourage them to do it. It's just that if it's going to happen, make it as safe as it can be. And it's going to happen, as we all know.
I think education is everything. This mum is actually going around schools talking about drugs and about her daughter and about what happened. And, you know, I asked her how much resistance she met to that. And she said initially quite a lot, but now it is kind of getting better, which is a relief, because I think it's really important that children are educated.
I think it's really interesting, because the one group who I think are able to carry a little bit of public sympathy and to really help educate the public are that group of parents, of whom you mentioned one, and I've met and spoken to others. But that group of parents who have lost a child to illegal drug supply because of the strength or the impurity of the product. And they are very powerful, more so perhaps than those who speak from the experience of being heroin users or long-term drug addicts who whilst, you know, someone like me who very much has enormous sympathy for anyone in that condition, I think most people find it hard to respond to somebody that they may believe brought it on themselves or many of the other around drug use. But I agree. I think parents who have lost children to the illicit drug market are powerful advocates for change.
And so that's a bit of work that you're doing, isn't it? That you're wanting to do that. And also, then, can we talk a little bit about your work with prison reform and what you're working towards there?
You know, I have been into many prisons, and I have met hundreds of people who have spent time in prison or who were in danger of spending time in prison. And over the whole of my 27-year career. And so it's something that I'm very familiar with. It's something that I've kind of over the years become more and more interested in. All I would say is that my firm conclusion is that prisons are a complete and utter disaster as far as form of reform, as far as any form of rehabilitation is concerned. And we need to stop using prison as the first resort when it comes to the punishment of offenders, because it is so damaging and exactly counterproductive to the aims of a sensible criminal justice system, which should be to reduce the amount of crime, not to increase it, which is what prison does.
So your idea, I mean, looking at the prison that you identified as being it's like an open prison, isn't it, where they have lots of rehabilitation. Your idea is that for people who are even of the worst crimes, that they can be given rehabilitation, they can be given things that they can do to make them understand that they can become productive members of a society. And if they're going to be in there for a very long time, at least they're achieving something and not just being left.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of putting it. I mean, I think I'd look at it in a slightly different way. I mean, what the Norwegian experience has shown is that if you make prisons as normal as possible, so that you make the conditions as much like the outside world, but you maintain a perimeter security, then what you do is you see that people, when they leave the institution, that their behaviour, they're much more able to reintegrate into society than if they are locked up in one of the sort of Victorian or other institutions that we have in the UK and particularly in America. So it's more around, the basic premise of how you take someone from a prison environment and you put them into society after their sentence and they can be productive in that society, is by normalizing the conditions while they're inside.
Really? You see, I'm really torn on this. I'm torn on this because I as a counsellor, I remember I went in to do a placement in prisons, and I decided that it was not for me. I couldn't do that because it took so long to get in to see the person. The first time I went there, it took so long to get back out. I didn't feel like I'd achieved anything because the following time when I went back, the prisoner wasn't there anymore. And it just, the whole thing just seems so frustrating. And if I feel frustrated on the outside, I started to think, what must it be like on the inside?
You make a couple of good points there, if I may say so. One is the ridiculous layers and levels of complex security to get into a prison as a professional visitor. One thing, for visitors who are perhaps family members and there's a risk in relation to bringing drugs or weapons or other things. I understand the need for scans and searches and so on. But it is ridiculously difficult to get into prisons. Every prison seems to have its own completely different set of rules. None of it seems to make any sense. I not long ago travelled halfway across the country to try and visit a client in prison, only to be told, there was some particular reason why we couldn't go that day, and they've had to close the visits down, and so they run in a way that makes it as difficult as possible for anyone to interact with it and coming from the outside. I mean, that's in normal times. I mean, I should tell you, I've spoken to prisoners in the last few days who tell me about the conditions in lockdown, and many of them are locked down in their cells for 23 hours, or in one case, 23 and a half hours a day. He was allowed out for half an hour a day of exercise. But apart from that, was locked down and locked up.
And of course, the mental impact on that.
Well, exactly.
If you're in there and you've gone in well, you're probably not going to come out as well as you went in. You're probably going to come out quite resentful, I imagine, as well, because it's the whole thing. I mean, I found it oppressive, frustrating, and thought, this is not for me. I could not go up the road of working with prisons, so I can't imagine.
Well, they shouldn't be the way they are, and they are really toxic environments, and they are worst of all. It seems to me, is that if you have a system which is so dysfunctional that it fails 3/4 or more of the time, because that's the recidivism rate of people coming out of prison. then you have to say to yourself, that means that our system is so rubbish that we are on the other side of every sentence creating an almost inevitable set of further victims of crime, because the system is so flawed and fails so badly so much of the time. You know, if you had a system, for example, you know, if 75% of the laptops or mobile phones that were sold would break down within a year of buying them and totally fall apart and not work, or even more quickly than that, then no one would buy them anymore, and the companies would go bust. But because the prison system is public and politically driven rather than results driven, we just accept that level of failure and that level of increased crime and increased victimhood as a result of a system that's so badly broken. And I you know, one of the reasons for writing the book was to be able to say, look, you know, it's not working, and if the public accept it as it is, they accept the consequence of what they say they want, which is longer sentences and more overcrowded prisons, which result from those longer sentences. Well, just watch out, because you're more likely to get mugged and you're more likely to get burgled. So you make your choice as to how you want society to work. And the Norwegian model and some of the other more humane and pragmatic models of criminal justice around the world, they lead to some of the lowest rates of crime, and particularly the kinds of crime that people are most afraid of: violent crime, sexual crime, and other forms of serious harm to the public. And so would you rather live in a society that had fewer people in prison and lower levels of crime, or a society like ours, which has relatively high numbers of people in prison and relatively high levels of crime? People can choose.
I had thought that, you know, I looked at the Norwegian prisons, and I had thought it did look very nice. And I mean, I know it's a prison, but it looked nice. And, you know, if you were a person who hadn't got a lot on the outside, would you not be tempted to want to be on that island, fishing and doing all those things? I'm not saying I want to go there myself, because from my perspective, I think the punishment, I understand it, but I don't understand it. So I'm kind of pretty torn on it. I think that the punishment is removal from society, removal from those you love, and then the punishment should be that you're actually removed. So you're taken away from everything, and that is a punishment. It is a punishment. So then you go and you become part of a community on the island, and you're working, and then, you know, that seems to me to be more humane. That not only are we going to remove you from your family, but we're going to lock you up in this little room with somebody that may not be somebody that you would want to mix with necessarily outside. We're going to mix you in a society of people that could make you a better criminal, like as you've said.
Well, that's what happens. Yeah, I mean, prisons are universities of crime. I mean, and it's a cliche, but it's true. You know, I've interviewed people for the book who knew virtually nothing about crime and drugs when they first went into prison, and in younger years when they'd just come out of the care system and their life was chaotic, they had nowhere to live. And then within a few months of being in prison, they were addicted to heroin. They were becoming much more sophisticated in their understanding of crime. And they came out and committed a load more serious crime because of what they learned in prison and because of the addictions that they picked up while they were in there. So you're right that, you know, I don't think most people can understand or appreciate just how psychologically damaging and how psychologically painful it is to be deprived of your freedom, just in and of itself. Most people might think to themselves, well, if it, you know, let's take a ridiculous example. Well, if I could live in a 5-star hotel all the time, that would be great. I'd love it. But I tell you, even that, I tell you, prisons are nothing like that. But even that, after a day, a week, a couple of weeks, people would say, oh, I want to go outside. I want to do what I want. I'm not, even though I've got all this luxury around me, I still actually am missing the most important thing to me, which is freedom to travel, freedom to see who I want to see. And make choices, exactly. And we're as a species, we are sort of designed to have freedom of movement. We're not designed to be restricted in that way, and it goes against our nature to be so restricted. So it is an enormous punishment in and of itself. And if you want to make the punishments as short as possible and the most effective that they can be in reducing further offending afterwards, you have to end up with conditions that look something like they do in Norway, which, as you say, is a condition of relative normal life. they still have fences, they still restrict people from leaving. But whilst people are in there, they have the opportunity to develop skills, to maintain continuity of contact with their family, their children, and other family members, and also to work, earn money, even in some cases to pay the mortgage on the outside by the work they do in prison so that they can keep a home. And so what happens is when people come out, they can more readily just re-engage with their community, with their family, and with employment. And they haven't got the same need to go back to crime as British criminals do when they come out of prison. They have nothing usually. They have nowhere to live. They have no job and no chance of getting a job. They've lost their family and they've lost contact with their children. And they come out and the only life they know is a life of crime. And that's what they've been left with after their prison sentence. And it's not surprising when you analyse it like that it's so ineffective.
So how will this come about? How can they close all the prisons? How can they make these changes? I mean, it costs an enormous amount of money. I know that, to keep people in there, but surely to close them down and to create something better is going to cost a lot more money.
No, it wouldn't. It would cost an awful lot less. So the first thing I would do, as you know, we talk about drug regulation and legalisation. If you were to rapidly adopt a policy of drug legalisation and drug regulation and licensing, and basically stop arresting and locking people up for drug crime, and also cut out most of the drug-related crime, we would see a huge downturn in the number of people being convicted and sent to prison in the first place. But even before we get there, the first thing I would do is I would take a good look at the prison population we have and ask ourselves how many of them actually need to be in there. Because when you look at the security classification and the risk assessments that are done in respect of prisons, many of them, if not the majority, are very low risk of certainly of violence. And if you put in place a program towards their release that gave them somewhere to live, that maintained their, or gave them access to employment and income, etc., you would also then dramatically reduce the risk of them reoffending on the outside. So I think half the prisoners in the country could be released within 6 months into a sort of non-custodial external kind of supervision arrangement. That would require some front-end investment, of course. But once you've got half the prisoners out of the system and you're saving half of the prison budget, and you've got all of these empty prisons, because you'd start closing down the worst performing prisons within months. And some of those worst performing prisons are in central London and central Manchester, places where land is very expensive. And so if you were to close these enormous prisons that are dotted around our cities, and to move to a much more rational type of establishment, you just think of the billions of pounds you would raise either by redeveloping the sites for public use or by selling them off to be commercially developed into apartments or offices or whatever. So you would have a front end cost, but it would rapidly be recouped by the sale of unnecessary land use around the country. But over time, if the prison population were reduced, as I would advocate, by 100% in terms of the current regime, but you would have a very small number of the Norwegian-style institutions for the most violent people. But even though they cost more per prisoner, those prisons, because we'd only end up with 10 or 15% of the total population of prisoners, the overall spend would be very, very low. And over time, rather like the spread of coronavirus, crime is a bit like that. And prisons do help spread coronavirus, but they also help spread crime. So in fact, if you reduce the number of prisons and prisoners, you're going to see a consequential effect on crime. And that's, over time, we should shrink the prison population even more. And that's what the evidence shows happens. Now, of course, I'm sure at some point we might come on to the question of whether any politician is brave enough or has enough influence to take any of this forward. And sadly, that's where I suspect these ideas, which I believe are entirely rational and would have exactly the effects I suggest, are unlikely to find much favour amongst the political classes and particularly those in power at the moment.
And of course the public, because they're misinformed. Most of them are misinformed. They think, get rid of the problem, put them in prison, and that's the end of it, really. Who cares?
I agree with you. I think information, one of the questions that's been put to me is, well, you must be anti-democratic, because the public do want tough sentences. They do want to see people walk away and throw away the key. And my answer to that is, I'm not anti-democratic. If the public vote for that, and they honestly understand what the consequence is, that they are going to thereby make more crime in society and make themselves more likely to be victims of crime, I don't mind. I mean, I don't agree with it, but I accept that's the consequence of democracy. But what
and of course, it will keep you in work.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I made most of my living for 26 years from criminal justice, and I'd love to make myself redundant. I mean, that's my real kind of aim is that you won't need criminal lawyers like me anymore. But you know, the point I make is that, you know, at the moment, I agree with you. I think there is so much misinformation in the political debate and in the media that people are voting on a completely false basis. Rather like much of the misinformation that's out there about vaccines and all sorts of other things, and people then say, well, I won't do that, not on the basis of facts, but on the basis of misinformation. That same dynamic is applicable to criminal justice policy, and it's particularly so in America, where, as you know from the book, they have the highest levels of incarceration on earth, and that's largely driven by ignorance amongst the population as to the impact of that policy, and misinformation that's put forward by candidates. But I think there's another element to it. It's not just misinformation. I think even with all the information, there are a significant number of people who would still say we want long sentences because they believe in punishment per se, even if in fact the punishment makes the problem worse. They still think that punishment is really important. And there's nothing new under the sun, because that's been the case for thousands and thousands of years across civilizations since time began. There's been a driving force in so many criminal justice systems of looking to punish people on a moral basis, rather than looking to use your criminal justice system to try to reduce crime, which is what I think it should be for.
I think there could be punishment, you see, because I think there are lots of ways that we could use prisoners, criminals, to work for society, to be productive in society, that could actually be doing something. They could be working, couldn't they? They could be producing things. It's still a punishment because they're still removed from what they were doing.
I agree with you that many of those in prison should be working, but not on some sort of chain gang on the motorway clearing up rubbish. They should be just working in a normal job and paying their bills and paying.
I was thinking of community service, you know, in between that. So that's a punishment, isn't it? Because if you're having to work and, you know, and you're doing community service, that's a bit of a nightmare to do if you don't want to be doing it.
It is, but it doesn't achieve anything. And in terms of reducing crime, the problem with community service is that it puts people in a position where they're just being treated in a very different way to everybody else. And my experience of community service being imposed on clients, particularly in sort of white collar cases where they may have quite a good job, is that the community service actually interrupts their careers, interrupts their work, and makes it more likely they'll lose their job because they're doing what's fairly should actually be paid for and be done anyway as part of our social infrastructure. And you know, I can see why some people might complain that you've got people on community service doing work that should be done by paid employees, you know, on salaries. And you know, why should it be done by people in this way, and someone else loses a job because of it? So I just don't agree with the concept and principle of punishment, full stop. The only thing that matters to me is, how do you reduce crime? If punishment were a way of reducing crime and making fewer victims, I'd reconsider my position, but it's just not. It doesn't work.
So what would you do then? What would you do to people? What would you do to somebody that had beaten up an old lady and taken her life savings? Or what would you do? I
think that raises a lot of interesting questions, and it's a good example because most people who beat up an old lady and take her life savings do so because they're addicted to drugs. That's the most common driver of that kind of crime. So my kind of thesis in the book is very much joined up. You can't. It's no good just changing one thing and expecting everything to change overnight. You have to look at it as a whole process. And so if you were to adopt the legalisation and regulation of drugs, and particularly the use of heroin treatment programs of the kind that I describe in the book, you would see a dramatic fall in that type of crime. But yes, there would be a persistent minority who, for one reason or another, would commit serious violent crime and would be a risk of committing further serious violent crime. And the answer to that is, for that small number, and it's a very small number of our total prison population, you use the Norwegian model of rehabilitative institutions which look to deal with people's mental health problems, that look to deal with any addiction issues that they have, and look to provide them with a path to release when they're released, where they have a job, a home, and contact with the people that they care about. And that's what you focus on, regardless of what they've done. So the purpose of the process is not to punish them, it's to stop it happening again. And I think most people, it's very interesting, because I've spoken to the victims of crime, and in particular I was filming for the BBC last year for my TV series. And I spoke to mothers who had lost their sons to knife murder and so on. Mm. And even some of them were able to say, look, we accept or can see the argument that one of the reasons the killer did what he or she did, or he it was in those cases, was because of the way the criminal justice system had failed beforehand, before the murder took place. And had the criminal justice system operated in a different way, possibly our son would still be alive. Now, they were nevertheless very emotional and emotive, and were saying we want them to never be released, and we think that in one case that we should bring back the death penalty. And I understand that emotion, but even people who are so emotional can, when faced with thinking about it carefully, when analysing and looking at what actually happens and what works and doesn't work, are prepared to say, we should perhaps look at a different course. I mean, one of the, just going back to your death by dangerous driving thing, I mean, I did a case a few years ago where it was a double death by dangerous driving. And my client was a van driver. He pulled out to overtake, not realising that he was on the crest of a hill because there was visual distortion, and had a head-on collision with a small car, killed the two occupants, who were an elderly couple. He was a young man who'd never been in trouble with the police. He'd killed two people, and what he'd done, the overtaking maneuver, was dangerous. I mean, but it was, not deliberate. There was no kind of malintent on his part. And the interesting thing about that case was that the family of the couple who died came along to court, and once they found out what sort of person he was, that he wasn't someone with a history of bad driving, that he was an honest but very tragic and serious mistake, they were prepared to say to the judge, we don't think he should be taken away from his children and go to prison, because we don't think that that's really what our parents would want, even though they were suffering with this enormous grief. So when you think about it, even people in their worst and darkest hour are prepared to be humane when they can see that the consequence of sending that young man to prison would be that his children would grow up for several years without a father, that they may lose their home, and to what end? And so I think, those people...
Probably in that case, I'd say, and he also has to live with the mistake that he made.
Yeah. Prison would have been... I mean, I've done other death by dangerous driving cases where I've had clients who've said, I feel like I want to and should go to prison because of the guilt I feel that I killed someone. But the guilt is the punishment for people like that. I mean, it's very different. Anyone who's been responsible for causing an accident and people being harmed or killed, whether it's as a result of dangerous driving, careless driving, or it's just an accident, they're going to have to live with that for the rest of their lives regardless. And I, for my part, think in most of those cases that bringing prison into the mix is unhelpful.
So would you say then that, so in this, if we already had that system, somebody who murdered somebody, meant to do it, not drug related, decided they didn't like somebody and murdered them, would they then be sent to a prison like the ones in Norway, where
absolutely they would. There are some,
and they would then be treated to find out what made them so angry. They would have some sort of rehabilitation.
The whole purpose of custody should be to seek to improve the likelihood of lawful, law-abiding and safe existence on the outside in the future. Because I think the one thing that when people argue for these tough conditions and tough sentences, the one thing I don't think people really think through is that almost everyone who is sent to prison will be released. Even people who have killed, and even people in some cases have killed more than once. And there are a tiny number of prisoners, 60 or 65, who will never be released. Terrorists and some of the really high-profile killers, like obviously like Peter Sutcliffe, who died recently anyway. But there are people who they're a small number that never be released. But 99% of murderers will be released one day. And so if you treat a murderer in a way which makes him more likely to be entrenched in his behaviour and become more violent and more angry, then you're creating a time bomb for the future, which is a mistake. Now, some may say, well, just don't release them ever then. And that's largely the American approach, life without parole for murder and many other crimes. But their society is hardly a beacon of hope when it comes to low levels of violence, low levels of gang and other serious crime activity, organised crime activity. So once again, if you argue for the sentences to be life means life, etc., live with the consequences, end up with a massive prison system as they do in America, and end up with thousands of murders a year on the streets of Britain. And that's not something that I'm looking forward to.
And also something that I did notice when my sister worked at the Marcopia prison she lives in Arizona. And, with some of the lifers, she says, they can go in at like 20, 25. They're very different people when they're in their 50s.
Well, absolutely. And that's one of the key learning experiences for those who kind of have looked at criminogenic behavior. And in particular, I talk in the book about the not wanting to criminalize and believing that we shouldn't criminalize children, because the difference in the mental state, the emotional and psychological development of someone at the age of 12, 15, 18, 21, 25 is they may as well be a different person. And most people intuitively know that. So if you send someone to prison for life without parole at the age of 20, as they do routinely in America, you are actually, it seems to me, you are making an enormous mistake. Apart from if you think about it, 60 or 70 years you're going to have to pay to keep them in prison, and the millions of dollars that is going to cost, you are also just wasting a human life. And so you're wasting vast amounts of money, you're wasting human life. And the interesting thing is, so some might say, well, it's surely a deterrent to life without parole. Everyone will know that you can't go around doing these things. But they still do it. And they do it because either they don't think they'll get caught, which is the most common reason for committing crime, or ironically, having life without parole is seen in some communities and some gangland areas. It's a bit of a badge of honor. Yeah. You're an LWAT prisoner. You're kind of one of the real hardcore that's never getting out. And so on the streets, that's the sort of bizarre way that people work and that the mind works is, if someone's gone to prison without parole, everyone thinks he's kind of tough, must be a really tough guy. And youngsters, teenagers are not influenced in the way that most adults would be, or older adults would be. If you're 15, you're easily impressed by things that inherently shouldn't be impressive. And likewise, if you're 18 or 19, for that matter. So
and there is a little bit of that here, isn't there? There is a little, with the gangs here, there's a little bit of that, and that's always been the case, I think. I remember when I was young, it was Borstal. People went to Borstal.
In the 70s, yeah, well, absolutely. And it was, and if you came out of that, there was an element that you were one of the tough kids on the street and stuff like that. So people weren't, young people are irrational, and young men are as irrational as the human species gets. And you just have to accept that sometimes young people will do things which are a mark of immaturity rather than necessarily a mark of who they will be for the rest of their lives. I think that's the case for pretty much anyone, actually. But it's certainly the case for many of those who have been through the care system, who make up a very large proportion of the prison system. Many of them have been exposed to trauma in their lives, have been exposed to violence, have been exposed to, early drug use from very young ages. And they're deeply damaged people when they commit crime and they get locked up in prison. And if you were to look at how they got to be so damaged, rather than just trying to damage them more, I think that would be a much more rational way to go about things.
Chris, thank you. I do hope that you can educate a bit more, because I do think it's down to education. I think it's down to getting public interest and getting them to understand. And certainly, I haven't read your book, but I am going to read your book, because when you're referring to it, I'm thinking, yeah, I can get that. But I prefer actually when I interview to just be as it is,
No,
like a
absolutely.
conversation, and then I feel like,
from the sound of it, I think you'll enjoy the book, because it covers things that you're clearly very interested in and knowledgeable about from your own past and your own experiences. So I hope you and everyone else will have a read, or a listen, in fact, because it's on audiobook if you want it on that.
and it's available on Amazon, isn't it?
Available on Amazon and pretty much anywhere you can get books. So, and as I say, on Amazon, you can get it on Audible or on Kindle, however you choose.
And can I put a link to your website? Do you want to give your website or any details now?
Well, anyone who wants to hear what I think about things can follow me on Twitter @CrimLawUK. I've got a YouTube channel, Crystal QC YouTube channel, which I put videos about contemporary issues around politics and law, but also there's a lot of content on there will be of interest to law students and young lawyers who are looking for sort of career advice. As I say, the book itself, you can get that wherever you get books.
So, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and it's been really interesting to and I've had a bit more insight into something that I kind of get and don't get at the same time. I think I'm probably just your average Joe public, really.
Well, that's who the book's written for. So there's nothing technical about it. Lots of juicy true crime. And but thank you, Alex. I really enjoyed the interview. And good luck with the podcast.
Thanks very much indeed.
Take care.